Welcome to today's episode of Princeton Review Live. Today we're going to be talking about linking verbs and auxiliary verbs, these little words that do a lot in sentences. So before we get started, as we always do, we're going to start with our warm-up. So grab something to write with, something to write on, and today what you're going to do is identify each linking and or auxiliary verb in each sentence below. So there are 4 sentences. You can label your paper 1 through 4, and some sentences might have more than one of these verbs, but every sentence has at least a linking or auxiliary verb. And again, we'll come back to this at the end, so write down the verb and the type of verb that you think it is. So number 1 says, the owl looks a bit scary. Number 2, Paola is biking to the beach. Number 3, the caterpillar became a butterfly. And number 4, the deer that was standing in the grass seemed quite friendly. Okay, so I'll give you a few more seconds here to look at these sentences. And again, we'll come back to them at the end. And since this is a live stream, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat box while we're streaming. So let's begin with the linking verb. What is a linking verb? Well, a linking verb, it literally links or connects a subject with some kind of thing that comes after that verb. So you can have a subject which could be a noun or a pronoun or some other thing at the beginning of the sentence, and then you'll have your linking verb, and then something else comes after that. And that something else is going to be in the predicate of the sentence, so that second part. And it's going to talk about some kind of condition or a relationship or a state of being. So the thing that comes after the linking verb is called a subject complement. We're not going to get into that today. I'm just giving you the terminology for those of you who care, who really want to know the nitty-gritty details. But it's not as important to know so much what that subject complement is as it is to know how these verbs work. Okay, so some of the most common linking verbs that you might see come from the form of the verb to be. Let's take a look at some common examples you've probably seen. Am, like I am. It is. We are. He was. They were. It has been. It might be. Could be. So these are just some of the many forms of the verb to be. And these are very common linking verbs. So many of them are small. Sometimes your linking verbs are going to be more than one word within a sentence. And let's see how they look when you put them into action. They don't do an action, but they can be in action. So our first example, Marissa is studious. So here we see Marissa as our subject. She is the person at the beginning of the sentence, the noun, is studious. So if you think about it, okay, Marissa is studious. We're describing Marissa. She's studious. But she's not actually doing something in the sentence. It's a state of being. She is studious. Now, if you said Marissa studies, that's an action, but Marissa is not an action. So is the linking verb in the sentence. And let's look at another one. That cupcake might be very sweet. It might be. It's not an action. This is just describing the possibility that the cupcake could be, might be, very sweet. And another one, Angelo has been a doctor for many years. Has been. It's another form of the verb to be. So in this case, if you want to know about the subject complement, here you would have doctor. Angelo has been what? A doctor. Or Angelo is a doctor. So you can have a noun in the subject complement, or in the case of the 2 sentences above, you might have some kind of an adjective describing it. So the cupcake might be very sweet. So very sweet is a subject complement. That's going back and describing that cupcake. And then the first one, studious, is a subject complement because it describes Marissa. So again, the state of being, to be, I am, we were, and all of them tend to be very common for your linking verbs because they're showing that something is or was or will be, or whichever conjugation of the verb to be is. And think of it, okay, so we have our state of being, they don't really demonstrate actions. This is what I've been saying here. So this little box here is just showing you that. But the verb to be is not the only verb that comes with linking verbs. So there are other ones, such as become, remain, grow, stay, prove, and turn. So in these cases, nothing's necessarily happening. There's not really an action going on. So you could say the plant grew. This is kind of defining the state of being. And there are other kinds of verbs that can be linking verbs as well, particularly those that pertain to the senses. So you could see something like appear or feel, look, smell, sound, taste. Any conjugation of these sense verbs and these other verbs that mean states of being are gonna be linking verbs when used in a particular way. So you'll see that some words can be either linking verbs or another type of verb in just a moment. And this is not a comprehensive list. These are just some examples of different types of verbs that you might see used as linking verbs. So for the sense one, we could say that coffee smells amazing. The coffee's not doing anything. It's just existing and it's giving off a smell that is, to the person who wrote this sentence, amazing. So again, these are linking verbs. They're expressing results, states of being, something with our senses. And as I mentioned a couple seconds back, linking verbs and action verbs, sometimes a linking can be an action verb as well. And we're not getting too much into action verbs today because that's not the whole point of today's conversation. But an action verb does an action. So I walk to the store. They drive to the bank. These are things that are, there's an action being done. It's not just a state of being or a result. So let's take a look at some examples here. The pie tasted delicious. Okay, the pie tasted delicious. We're talking about a sense, the sense of literally taste. We have the word taste here. And how did it taste? It tasted delicious. That's our subject complement. But if we take that sentence and we tweak it to say, Nithya tasted the pie. Well, now this is not talking about the sense of taste. Nithya is doing an action, right? Nithya tasted. She tasted what? She tasted the pie. So in this second case, this is not a linking verb. This is an action verb. So let's just write that down so you have it clear here. So action, and then over here, linking in our first sentence. Okay, so let's look at a couple more sentences. The puppy looked at the pie, and the pie looked perfect. So one of these two is linking, and one is an action verb. Which one is going to be the linking verb? Which one isn't actually showing an action, and which one is showing some type of action? In this case, the puppy looked. Puppy looked at what? Looked at the pie. So this is an action verb. It did the looking. Whereas in the next sentence, the pie looks perfect. This is just a state of being. So that's going to be our linking. And again, not to get too much into the nitty-gritty details of all of the grammar, but if you're not really sure what's going on, you're like, well, I don't really know. There's linking and action, and there's a subject complement thing. And we've talked in other sessions here about direct objects. So what you can do if you really want to get into the detailed part here is ask yourself, okay, do the words that come after the verb, do they receive the action? Or do they provide some kind of information about the subject? Okay, and if the word or the words that come after, because remember, it could be multiple words, if they give you information about the subject, then you have a linking verb and a subject complement. So in our first one, the pie tasted, words that come after delicious. Delicious is giving us information about that pie. right? So that means that it's a linking verb and our subject complement. And if the word or words receive the action, then you have an action verb and the direct object. So in the second sentence, Nithya tasted what? The pie. Pie is not referring back to Nithya. That's your direct object. All right, and technically this I here should be lowercase down in this little footnote, so just pretend that that's lowercase because it's part of the same sentence. So that's all of our linking verbs, and then we have these auxiliary verbs, which you might pronounce auxiliary, but technically it's auxiliary. And there are a lot of purposes that this type of small verb serves. So you can also call auxiliary verbs helping verbs because what they do is they literally help the main verb in the sentence to do something. It might be expressing time, mood, or emphasizing something. And they really have a huge impact on the sentence as a whole. So we'll see a few examples in just a moment. The main infinitives or verbs that you're going to see associated with auxiliary are to be, as we just saw with our linking verbs, but you also have to do and to have. So let's look at some of the purposes that these verbs do. They can form certain tenses. And we have a live stream from before about the different kinds of tenses, so feel free to refer back to that one if you want to learn more about the specific tenses and what they mean. I'm just going to give you a little snippet here of which ones are formed with the certain word. So to be is part of what forms the progressive tense. So you can say the turtle is crossing, was crossing, will be crossing. And in these cases, you have your is, your was, and your will be. So you've got, just to name the tenses, your present progressive tense, past progressive tense, and your future progressive tense. And side note, progressive is also sometimes referred to as the continuous tense because it's a continuous action. Then you have the perfect tense, which is formed with the verb to have and example sentences. Now you have the turtle had crossed, the turtle has crossed, and the turtle will have crossed. So in this one, we've got the past perfect, the present perfect, and the future perfect. And there's one more tense that's less commonly used, but the perfect progressive tense, it's formed with to have and to be. So there's a lot of little words going on to create this tense. For instance, you could have the turtle had been crossing, or in the present perfect progressive or present perfect continuous, the turtle has been crossing, or the turtle will have been crossing. So you can't form any of these three tenses without auxiliary verbs. And what are the auxiliary verbs doing? They're helping to create the tenses. They're working with the main verbs. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to type them in. So that's auxiliary verbs and tenses. Okay, no questions yet. But if you do have them, bring them on. And we'll see a few more uses of auxiliary verbs. So questions. Well, you can use auxiliary verbs to ask questions. And a really easy way to make a question is to take the auxiliary verb, then the subject, and then your main verb. So you could say, do you believe in unicorns? You see, so we've got the auxiliary do. And then your subject is you, and the main verb will be believe. Have you had dinner? That's another one with a to have. Do, did, have, different ways to form auxiliaries or questions with auxiliaries. And you can also use auxiliaries to add emphasis to something. And what you're going to do is just take the simple past, present, or future form and put the auxiliary before it. So I could say, yes, I do believe in unicorns. I do, as opposed to I believe in unicorns. Really, I'm saying the same thing, but with the I do, I'm emphasizing. Did you clean your room? Yes, I did clean my room. I cleaned my room. So they have slightly different nuanced meanings when you add the auxiliary verb to emphasize something. And the most common auxiliary you're going to see for emphasis is to do. And it's sometimes called the emphatic do. But You can also use the other auxiliaries for emphasis, depending on what it is that you're trying to say. And then one more main thing to cover here is auxiliary verbs when it comes to the passive voice. So passive voice occurs when the subject is not doing the action. It's receiving the action. And active voice occurs when the subject is actually doing the action. So let's take a look. May built the fire. So what's the subject? Subject here is may. Built is the action or the verb. Built what? The fire. So the subject in this case is doing the action. May built that fire. And so this is going to be our active. But we could put this in passive voice and say, the fire was built by May. We're literally saying the same thing. The second one is a lot wordier than the first, but the idea that's being conveyed is the same. These are simple sentences, but sometimes you'll see longer sentences that get really clunky when you use the passive voice. So let's take a look. Jonah has been building campfires since he was a child. All right, fair enough. Jonah's been building these campfires for could be a long time. We don't know how old Jonah is. But if we wanted to write the same thing in the passive voice, take a look. Campfires have been being built by Jonah since he was a child. That's such a mouthful. It's kind of not a nice and eloquent way of saying the same thing as Jonah has been building campfires since he was a child, even though what's conveyed is the same thing. So which version is more concise? In both of these examples, both sets of examples, our passive voice, or the sentences on the right, are longer, and those on the left are more concise and more commonly used. So it's more often that you'll see the active voice used, but both forms are technically grammatically correct. For those of you watching who are interested in the SAT and ACT standardized testing, well, you might know that these tests are a lot of times looking for concision. So if everything's grammatically correct and you were down to two, you want to go for the one that's more concise, which is almost always going to be the active voice. So that's not to say that the passive voice is wrong or you should never use the passive voice. It's just that when you want to be more clear, more direct, you want to go for the active voice. And there are certain occasions during which you would want to use passive. I'm not going to get into that today. So now we can take a look at a couple examples of what you might see in terms of auxiliary verbs being tested on the ACT or SAT. So the sentence here. Yesterday, it was storming for hours when the power finally went out. All right, so you see your underlying portion was storming. And then, of course, if you were testing, you would look at your answer choices and you'd have A, no change. And you could look at choices B, C, and D. Stormed, and had been storming. So yesterday, it was storming for hours when the power finally went out. Was storming when the power finally went out. It's a form of the past tense, and we're talking about yesterday, but is it the right tense? That's the question. We do have an auxiliary, because it was storming. And the SAT doesn't care if you know what an auxiliary is, you just have to know how to use it and which tense to use. So let's look at the other answer choices. Yesterday, it stormed for hours when the power finally went out. Doesn't seem right. That's your simple past tense. We have when the power finally went out. So it seems like some kind of ongoing action was at play. Yesterday, it had stormed for many hours when the power finally went out, or yesterday, it had been storming for many hours when the power finally went out. Take a moment to think about it. And the correct choice for this one is going to be D. It had been storming. So it was an action that had started and it was ongoing for a long time. And let's take a look at another question that you might see, another type of question. Keeping with this idea of storms here, the wind knocked the tree down during the storm last week. Okay. So we have an FGHJ. This would be more of an ACT thing with the lettering. And the ACT would be more likely to ask this kind of question. So we have no change. And then we have the wind knocking the tree down during the storm last week. Well, the first part of G sounds okay, but the wind knocking the tree down during the storm last weekend, and something's missing. That's an incomplete thought, so it can't be G. So you can get rid of choice G. And then H, the tree was knocked down by the wind during the storm last weekend. Well, grammatically that sounds fine. So we can keep that for a second. Let's look at J. The tree having been knocked over by the wind during the storm last weekend. Really long, really wordy, and an incomplete idea. So that's not going to work either. But if you're down to F and H, the wind knocked the tree down versus the tree was knocked down by the wind, which is going to be correct? Well, grammatically, they're both fine. There's no grammatical error there, but which one is more concise and direct? The more concise one here is going to be the first one, F, which is in the active voice. So that's something that you could see tested. All right, so we've gone through linking verbs, auxiliary verbs, lots of different purposes and things, but let's take a look at actually using them in sentences. So it's your turn here to choose the correct answer. So number one, after having spent many hours painting the walls of his new house, Jonah blank exhausted. Okay, Jonah looked exhausted. Jonah will be looking exhausted. Jonah had been looking exhausted. Oh, and D is the same as B, will be looking exhausted. So let's pretend that D is not there. There's a typo there. So Jonah looked, will be looking, or had been looking exhausted. In this case, the correct answer is just going to be A, looked exhausted. It's not that he will be looking exhausted. He spent many hours painting the walls, so it's something that already happened. And it's not had been looking because it's not an action that happened before some other action and was going on for a while. So number two, by this time next year, Lily blank 18. Lily will turn, will be turning, will have been turned, will have turned. So take a moment here to think about it. Which makes the most sense. By this time next year, D, will have turned 18. And then we'll look at one more. Celia is very corned, that should say concerned, about the quality of the water she drinks each month blank. Each month blank. Okay, so what we see changing is quite a lot, really. We have several things going on, so we want to read very carefully. We have some context. So we know that she is very concerned about the quality of the water that she drinks. Each month, she purchases a new water filter. Each month, she is purchasing a new water filter. Each month, a new water filter are purchased by her. And each month, a new water filter had been purchased by her. So what can you rule out? What's definitely not going to work here? You heard me stumble over choice C. Each month, a new water filter are purchased. So filter is singular, are is plural, so it can't be C. And let's look at the others. She purchases a new water filter. Well, that seems to work. She is purchasing a new water filter. That's kind of funky, right? We've got that present or continuous tense going on. Each month she is purchasing a new water filter wouldn't be correct. And then choice D, a new water filter had been purchased by her. Well, that tense is kind of off. We know that she is very concerned. So we want something that's in the present tense. So D is not going to work. And the only answer choice that's left is going to be A. Each month she purchases a new water filter. And you see that it is the active voice. So choices C and D had passive voice going on and they had other errors in them. Okay, so that brings us back to the warm up from today. Again, any questions, type them in now. As I go through this warm up now, we're switching to the cool down to reveal the answers here. So the owl looks a bit scary. Our verb that is a linking or auxiliary in the sentence is which one? We have here the owl looks. Is looks doing an action or helping to create some kind of a verb? It's not. So the looks here is just going to be a linking verb. Number 2, Paula is biking to the beach. So the verb is biking. This is not a state of being or a result. So this is going to be an auxiliary verb because the word is helping the verb to bike. So she is biking. That's our present continuous or present progressive tense. That's an auxiliary. And number 3, the caterpillar became a butterfly. So the verb, and there's only one verb in the sentence, is became. Is it linking or auxiliary? Is it helping something or is it showing some kind of a state of being or turning into something? In this case, the caterpillar literally turns into or results as a butterfly. So this is a linking verb. And then the last one here, it's actually a double whammy. We've got 2 sets of verbs going on. So the deer that was standing in the grass seemed quite friendly. So was standing. Is that a state of being? Or is it a tense or passive voice or a question or the other thing that we talked about, which is emphasis? In this case, the was is helping to form the tense was standing. So that's going to be an auxiliary verb. And then finally, seemed. Seemed quite friendly. Is there something being helped here? No. Friendly is referring back to the deer in this longer sentence. So that means that seemed here is just going to be a linking verb. Okay, so there are lots of little nuances here when you're dealing with linking verbs and auxiliary or helping verbs, however you want to call them. But just know what they do and how to form the different tenses. If you're worried about your standardized testing, make sure to review the different tenses and what they mean so that you choose the correct answer when it comes to your test. So if you guys don't have any questions, thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll see you all next time.